Before the sun fully rises, the Giza Plateau rests in a muted light, where pale gold sand blends into the grey of ancient stone. In that moment, the pyramids do not appear as familiar symbols of Egyptian power. They feel quieter than that, like shapes that have learned how to wait. They stand without urgency, without explanation, as if time itself has slowed around them. Most visitors are offered a simple story. Everything here, they are told, begins with the pharaohs, with kings, dynasties, and divine authority made solid in stone. But when the light shifts and settles across the limestone surface, subtle details begin to stand apart from that narrative. Faint scars in the rock, edges worn smooth in ways that do not feel hurried, blocks resting in positions that suggest they were not placed in response to royal command, but as part of something already underway. If one lingers long enough, a different impression forms. Giza does not speak like a beginning. It feels like a continuation. Like the final chapter written atop pages that have already been filled, erased, and written over again. Beneath the visible structures lie stone foundations that do not behave like the bases of tombs. They feel preparatory, measured, as though the land itself had been tested and shaped before anyone decided what would ultimately rise above it. There are no inscriptions to guide us here. No names carved into these lower stones. No dates pressed into their surfaces. Instead, there is silence, an unusual silence for a civilization otherwise so eager to record itself. And it is that silence that makes the stone feel out of place. Not wrong, simply older than the story we usually tell. Early surveyors who arrived at Giza focused on what dominated the horizon: corridors, chambers, and monumental geometry, but beneath their attention were quieter features. Flat surfaces cut into bedrock where no ritual demanded them, straight edges hidden below later masonry, plains of stone that seem less like endings and more like beginnings that were never finished. At dawn, when the pyramids cast long shadows across the sand, their outlines appear almost too precise for the ground beneath them to be accidental. The structures seem to fit the plateau rather than impose themselves upon it, as if the space had already been definedly and oriented, and waiting long before the first massive block was lifted into place. Standing near these deeper stones creates a difficult sensation to name. They do not feel crude, like early experiments, nor do they feel triumphant, like final achievements. They occupy a middle ground, a transitional moment, a time when people clearly understood stone, space, and direction, yet left behind no language to explain what they were doing or why. These stones are not scattered. They follow straight lines and right angles that only reveal their intent when viewed as a whole. Seen this way, the Giza Plateau resembles less a spontaneous construction site and more a prepared stage. A surface shaped deliberately so that something greater could one day rise upon it. What deepens the mystery is repetition. Similar, unfinished blocks appear in multiple places, abandoned yet intact. They do not resemble the remains of failed projects. They resemble tools that were no longer needed once their purpose was fulfilled, as if the task was never to build monuments, but to prepare the land for those who would. In the stillness of the desert, time compresses. Thousands of years blur together when measured against stone. Rock does not track history by dynasties or reigns. It records rain, pressure, and erosion processes so slow they escape a human lifetime. And it is these processes, etched into Giza's foundations, that raise the first quiet question. What was here before Egypt? Not an empire. Not a named civilization. Perhaps not even a single people. But something more subtle. A body of knowledge. A way of reading land, water, and sky. A tradition that understood orientation and balance, and saw preparation as more important than display. Those who carried this knowledge may not have needed monuments to remember themselves. What they left behind was readiness. When the pharaohs arrived, they did not step onto empty ground. They inherited a landscape already measured and aligned, a plateau already shaped to receive meaning. Upon that foundation, they built their legacy grand, visible, and carefully recorded. Yet beneath that legacy, the earlier stones remain. They do not argue with history. They simply exist alongside it, suggesting that the story did not begin where we were taught it did, that some chapters were never meant to speak loudly, only to endure. As the sun climbs higher, Giza becomes familiar again. The pyramids glow with authority and clarity. But below them, in the places where shadows once lingered, there remains a sense that something was here first, something patient, something quiet, something that prepared the world, then stepped aside. That unspoken presence follows us as we leave the plateau. It drifts with us across the desert and back into a time when this land was not yet dry, when memory was carried not in words but in stone. And from that earlier world, the story begins to unfold slowly, layer by layer, just as stone. Long before sand ruled this landscape, the land breathed differently. The Sahara, now defined by emptiness, once held water in its low places and grass across its plains. It was not a barrier, but a living corridor. Rain arrived in seasons. Lakes expanded and shrank. Rivers appeared, then retreated, and through these rhythms, human life adapted quietly, learning how to listen to a land that was constantly changing. Evidence of this earlier world lies scattered across regions that today seem incapable of sustaining life. Beneath dunes and rocky plateaus are traces of shorelines where water once lingered. Ancient lake beds hold shells and plant remains, pressed into sediment like memories sealed in clay. These are not symbols or myths. They are physical records of a time when the desert was green enough to invite settlement. In that world, movement was not random. People followed the water. They returned to the same basins year after year, adjusting their camps as shorelines shifted. Over time, paths formed soft at first, then increasingly defined. The land began to teach its inhabitants where to walk, where to pause, and where to wait. This was not the beginning of architecture, but it was the beginning of planning. As the climate stabilized for a time, these communities learned to read patterns that extended beyond the ground beneath their feet. The sky mattered. The timing of rain depended on the movement of stars. The length of daylight guided migration. Without writing, these observations were passed down through repetition and ritual. Knowledge survived not because it was recorded, but because it was useful. In places far from the Nile, stones were arranged with care, not stacked into walls, but set upright, placed in lines, or grouped into circles. At first glance, they appear simple, yet their positions often align with the horizon in ways that only make sense. When the sun or certain stars reach specific points in the year, these were not monuments. They were markers, quiet tools for remembering time. The presence of such arrangements suggests something important. These early communities were not merely reacting to their environment, they were anticipating it. They understood that survival depended on foresight, and foresight required shared reference points, places where knowledge could be anchored in the landscape itself. As generations passed, techniques refined themselves. Stone was shaped not just to cut or grind, but to define space. Ground was leveled where people gathered repeatedly. Shallow basins were reinforced to hold water a little longer through dry spells. None of this required centralized authority. It required consistency, attention, memory. Then the climate began to shift again. Rain grew less predictable. Lakes that had lasted centuries started to shrink more quickly. Grasslands thinned. What had once been a wide, connected environment fractured into isolated pockets of water and life. The land that once guided movement now began to resist it. In response, people adapted as they always had by moving. But this movement was not sudden. It unfolded over many generations. Groups lingered at familiar places, returned when they could, then finally let go when the land no longer answered. Slowly, the flow turned eastward, toward a river that never fully disappeared. The Nile was not discovered in this moment. It had always been there, but now it became something else, a refuge, a place where water arrived reliably, even as the surrounding world dried. Those who approached it did not arrive empty-handed. They carried with them ways of thinking shaped by centuries of life in a fluctuating landscape. They understood how to position camps above flood levels. They recognized stable ground by feel and sound. They had learned how to observe the sky for timing and orientation. These were not abstract skills. They were embodied knowledge, refined through necessity. As these groups settled closer to the river, their practices began to converge. Ideas that once traveled across open plains now gathered along a narrow corridor. Techniques that had been scattered became concentrated. What had once been regional knowledge began to feel like a shared tradition. This is where the story often jumps ahead. History prefers beginnings that are easy to name. Dynasties, kings, capitals. But beneath those clear markers lies a slower accumulation, one that cannot be traced to a single origin point. The early Nile settlements did not appear fully formed. They grew from patterns already in motion. Camps became villages. Seasonal return became permanence. Observational markers gave way to structured spaces. The river did not create these ideas. It received them. What matters here is not the scale of what was built, but the continuity of how people thought. The same attention to alignment, the same sensitivity to land and water, appears again and again as one follows the evidence eastward. It is not identical. It evolves, but it does not start from nothing. This continuity suggests that the rise of Egyptian civilization was not a sudden awakening, but a focusing, a narrowing of knowledge into a place where it could finally be sustained without constant retreat. The Nile allowed what had once been temporary to become permanent. When later generations looked back, they saw only the river and the structures along it. The desert beyond seemed empty, irrelevant. The memory of a green Sahara faded quickly once it no longer existed, and with it, the memory of the people who learned to build while the land was still alive. Yet traces remain, not in grand ruins, but in habits, in choices of orientation, in the quiet confidence with which later builders shaped stone and space. These were not inventions made in isolation. They were inheritances. Understanding this earlier world reframes everything that follows. Giza, when it eventually rises, does so at the end of a long migration of ideas. Its placement, its orientation, and even its ambition begin to look less like a sudden expression of power, and more like the culmination of a relationship between humans and land that began thousands of years earlier, when the desert itself was still learning how to become dry. As the Sahara fell silent, its lessons did not vanish. They moved, slowly and patiently, toward the river. And there they waited ready. The great Sphinx rests in a hollow carved from bedrock, its body pressed low against the earth as if listening. From a distance, it appears timeless, a guardian frozen between worlds. But up close, the stone tells a more complicated story, one that does not align neatly with the dry silence of the desert that surrounds it today. Along the walls of the Sphinx enclosure, Deep vertical grooves run down the limestone surface. They are not sharp. They are rounded, softened by repetition. Their pattern is uneven, flowing, as though shaped not by tools, but by something persistent and patient. These marks do not resemble the shallow abrasion left by wind-driven sand. They resemble erosion caused by water by rainfall that arrives again and again, carving slowly, deliberately. This is where discomfort enters the narrative. Egypt, as we know it, has not experienced sustained heavy rainfall in recorded history. The climate that shaped dynastic civilization was already dry, defined by predictable floods of the Nile rather than seasonal rainstorms. Yet the stone surrounding the Sphinx seems to remember a different environment, one in which water fell from the sky often enough to leave its signature behind. This does not announce itself loudly. There is no inscription declaring an earlier age, no date carved into the rock, only the quiet insistence of erosion that does not fit comfortably within the accepted timeline. The stone does not argue. It simply retains the memory of conditions that no longer exist. The body of the Sphinx amplifies this tension. Its proportions feel unusual. Massive shoulders, a long, stretched torso, and above them, a head that seems almost too small, too refined, as though it belongs to a different phase of work. The contrast is subtle, but persistent enough to invite questions. Not accusations, just questions. If the head were altered at a later time, reshaped to reflect a new ruler or symbolic identity, then the body beneath it may belong to a much earlier conception, one formed when the surrounding landscape was not yet desert, when rain still shaped the stone directly. This idea does not require certainty to be unsettling. It requires only the possibility that the Sphinx, like the plateau itself, may be layered, that it may represent continuity rather than origin, a monument adjusted, reused, and reinterpreted as cultures changed around it. Beneath the surface, the questions deepen. Below the Sphinx in nearby causeways, tunnels and shafts extend into the bedrock. Some are sealed, others partially explored. Their walls bear signs of water exposure, inconsistent with the dry conditions under which they are usually dated. Pools form in their lowest chambers, not simply from modern seepage, but as though the rock itself has known water before. These underground spaces do not speak clearly. They do not explain their purpose. They sit outside the familiar categories of tomb or temple. Their silence mirrors the silence of the erosion above present, observable and difficult to place. What matters is not whether every detail points to the same conclusion. It is that multiple details point away from a single, simple origin. The Sphinx does not behave like a monument designed and executed in one moment of history. It behaves like something inherited. In this light, the Sphinx becomes less a symbol of royal power and more a witness. It stands at the edge of a memory that extends beyond written tradition. Its stone carries evidence of a climate that predates dynasties, of environmental conditions that shaped human behavior long before kings ruled the Nile. When the later builders arrived, they may not have seen this as a problem. They may not have needed to understand the full history of what they inherited. The monument was already there, massive, imposing, oriented with care. All it required was adaptation and adjustment of identity, rather than a reinvention of form. And so the Sphinx remained. As the desert expanded and rain retreated, the memory of water faded from human experience. But the stone did not forget. It held on to the slow language of erosion, recording a time when storms crossed the plateau and carved their presence into limestone. This memory does not rewrite history, it complicates it. It suggests that the landscape of Giza was not empty or inactive before dynastic Egypt emerged. That significant shaping occurred under conditions no longer visible, guided by people whose names were never preserved. Standing before the Sphinx today, it is easy to focus on what it represents: kingship, guardianship, eternity. But beneath those symbols lies a quieter truth. The Sphinx is not only a creation of civilization, it is a survivor of environment. It remembers rain, and in remembering, it hints that the story of Giza begins not with rulers and rituals, but with a land that was once alive, wet enough to shape stone, and patient enough to wait for history to arrive. Across North Africa, far beyond the familiar boundaries of the Nile Valley, stone appears where history says it should not. Not in the form of cities or towering monuments, but in quieter arrangements that seem almost hesitant to draw attention to themselves. Lines of standing stones stretch across open ground. Circles form where no settlement remains. Platforms lie flattened into bedrock, carefully prepared, then abandoned. These places do not announce who built them. They simply exist. What makes these structures unsettling is not their size, but their consistency. They appear across vast distances, separated by deserts, plateaus, and dried lake beds. Yet they share a common language of form. Stones placed at measured intervals. Orientations that align with horizons rather than with habitations. Spaces cleared and leveled for reasons that cannot be explained by daily survival alone. This was not random behavior. It was intentional, repeated, and shared. And yet, there are no names, no inscriptions, no symbols declaring ownership or devotion, no rulers immortalized in relief. For a world that later became obsessed with recording identity, this absence feels deliberate. It suggests that the builders did not think of their work as something that required authorship. The structures were functional, not commemorative. They existed to serve a purpose, not to be remembered. Many of these sites sit in places that once held water. Ancient lake margins, now dry, reveal stone arrangements positioned just above old shorelines. These stones do not block water or contain it. They mark space. They define where people gathered, observed, or waited. In some locations, ground has been cleared repeatedly, as if the same spot was returned to over generations, long after temporary shelters had disappeared. What remains is not architecture in the later sense. It is organization, a way of shaping space that does not rely on walls or roofs, but on placement and alignment. These builders understood how people moved through land, how sightlines worked, how to anchor memory to a location even when nothing permanent stood there. The lack of decoration is striking. There is no attempt to beautify or personalize the stone. Edges are shaped only as much as needed. Surfaces are smoothed where function demands it, left rough where it does not. This restraint points to a mindset focused on precision rather than expression. The work was meant to last, not to impress. Over time, as climates shifted and regions dried, these places were left behind. Wind buried them. Sand softened their outlines. To later observers, they appeared meaningless, too simple to belong to a civilization, too isolated to fit into a known cultural map. But simplicity does not mean ignorance. Often it suggests confidence. Confidence does not need explanation. What ties these sites together is not proof of a single culture, but evidence of shared practice. Knowledge moving through contact rather than conquest. Techniques learned by watching, copying, refining. One group did not need to dominate another for ideas to spread. Movement across open landscapes was enough. When people eventually reached the Nile in greater numbers, they brought this approach with them. They already knew how to choose ground that would endure. They understood how to define space without enclosing it. They had learned that orientation mattered, that buildings and markers gained. meaning when aligned with the sky and the land around them. These unnamed builders did not vanish. They dissolved into what came next. Their work did not need preservation because it had already done its job. It shaped habits. It trained perception. It prepared human thought for permanence. When later societies began to leave records, they wrote from within a world already structured by these earlier choices. This is why their absence in history is misleading. They are not missing. They are embedded. Their influence lies beneath what is visible, beneath what is credited, beneath what is celebrated. They appear wherever later builders seem unusually confident, unusually precise, unusually aware of space. Giza, when viewed through this lens, becomes less mysterious and more revealing. It is not an anomaly rising from nothing. It is the place where unnamed knowledge finally encountered the resources to express itself fully. The builders without names did not seek legacy. They created conditions, and in doing so, they ensured that when history finally began to speak, it would do so from ground that had already been prepared. In the quarries scattered across Egypt and beyond, stone still carries the memory of being shaped. Long after tools have vanished and hands have turned to dust, the marks remain, lines pressed into granite, channels carved through basalt, surfaces flattened with a consistency that invites closer attention. At first glance, these details seem technical, unremarkable, but when studied patiently, they begin to whisper a quieter question. Who is capable of this? Granite and basalt are not forgiving materials. They resist impact. They dull simple tools quickly. In the conventional story, these stones were shaped with copper implements, assisted by sand and time. And in many cases, this explanation works. The marks are rough, irregular, consistent with slow abrasion, but scattered among them are cuts that behave differently. Some grooves run straight for surprising distances. Their edges are clean, their depth consistent. Parallel lines appear where a single tool seems to have passed repeatedly along the same path. These are not the chaotic scars of trial and error. They reflect control, intention, a steady hand guided by expectation rather than experiment. What makes these marks uncomfortable is not that they exist, but that they appear early. Some are found beneath later layers of quarrying, partially buried, as if belonging to a phase that came before the techniques we recognize. Others appear on blocks that were never transported or completed, stone abandoned mid-process, left exactly where work once stopped. Abandoned stone tells a different story than finished monuments. It reveals methods rather than results. And here, the methods seem unusually confident. The cuts do not hesitate. They do not wander. They suggest that whoever made them already understood how stone would respond. This does not require advanced machinery to be intriguing. It requires only familiarity gained through repetition over time. A tradition of stoneworking refined across generations, not invented for a single royal project. The stone does not suggest innovation. It suggests inheritance. In some places, surfaces show signs of rapid material removal, as if efficiency mattered. In others, edges are smoothed only where they needed to be precise, left unfinished elsewhere. This selectivity implies planning, a clear understanding of which surfaces mattered and which did not. Such decisions are not made by novices. What complicates the picture further is geography. Similar cutting patterns appear across distant regions at quarries, separated by hundreds of kilometers. Not identical, but recognizable, like dialects of the same language. Enough similarity to suggest shared knowledge, enough variation to show local adaptation. If these marks belonged solely to the Old Kingdom, we might expect uniformity tied to centralized authority. but their distribution suggests something looser. Knowledge moving through people rather than commands. Techniques passed hand to hand, not decreed from above. This challenges a subtle assumption that monumental stonework began only when power demanded it. But stone does not wait for kings. It waits for those who understand it. And understanding stone is not a political act. It is a practical one. When later builders erected temples and pyramids, they did not need to invent how to cut and shape hard stone from nothing. They refined what already existed. They standardized. They organized labor. They scaled up. But the underlying familiarity, the sense of what was possible, was already present. This is why some quarry marks feel out of place. They do not align perfectly with the methods later recorded or depicted. They belong to a quieter phase, one that left no manuals and no imagery, only results. A phase where experimentation had already ended and practice had taken over. The stone itself offers no names. It does not reveal the faces of its shapers, but it does preserve their confidence. Confidence does not arise suddenly. It grows slowly, through repeated success, through failure corrected over time. Seen this way, the clean cuts are not anomalies. They are traces of continuity, evidence that long before pyramids rose, people were already learning how to speak the language of stone fluently. And once a language exists, it does not disappear. It evolves. It adapts. It waits for the moment when it can be used at a larger scale. Giza, in this sense, was not the birth of stone mastery. It was its most visible expression. The cuts that seem to clean for copper do not demand an extraordinary explanation. They suggest something more ordinary and more profound. Time, practice, and a lineage of skill that predates the names history chose. Before stone was raised high enough to cast long shadows, the sky was already being measured. Long before temples framed the horizon or pyramids locked themselves to cardinal points, human attention had learned to lift upward and wait. The sky was the one surface no one could shape, yet it became the first place where order was clearly observed. Across landscapes that are now silent, stones still point toward where the sun once rose on particular days. Not every day, only certain moments. The turning of seasons, the longest night, the return of light. These alignments appear again and again, scattered across regions that never shared a single kingdom, yet seem to share a single habit of watching. This kind of observation does not happen quickly. It requires patience across generations. One lifetime can notice a pattern. Several lifetimes are needed to confirm it. And only after that does alignment become intentional. What survives in stone suggests that this process had already occurred long before Egyptian religion formalized the heavens into gods and myths. In the open spaces of the ancient Sahara, markers were placed not to impress, but to remember. A single upright stone might mark where a star first appeared above the horizon. A short line of stones might track the path of the sun as it shifted slightly each year. These were not calendars in the modern sense. They were reminders embedded in the land. What is striking is their restraint. No attempt was made to enclose the sky or dominate it. The stones did not rise high. They did not compete with the horizon. They simply pointed. They allowed the sky to do the rest of the work. In this simplicity lies confidence. The builders trusted that the patterns would repeat. As climates changed and people moved, this sky knowledge traveled with them. It did not depend on a specific place. It depended on memory, rhythm, and shared observation. Wherever people settled for long enough, the sky became part of their orientation. It told them when to move, when to prepare, when to wait. By the time communities gathered along the Nile, this relationship with the sky had already matured. The river brought stability, but the sky brought timing. Floods did not arrive at random. They followed celestial cues. The rising of certain stars coincided with changes in water and land. Those who noticed this could anticipate survival rather than react to crisis. This is where later precision begins to feel less miraculous. When the pyramids were aligned with astonishing accuracy, they did not invent that alignment from nothing. They refined it. They fixed it in stone permanently. What had once been marked temporarily across open ground became eternal geometry. The familiar claim that the pyramids reflect a pattern in the stars becomes more intriguing when viewed this way. Not as a sudden leap of symbolic imagination, but as the final echo of a much older habit. The sky had been mirrored on the land long before monuments made the reflection obvious. Even the idea of tracking slow celestial changes suggests depth of memory. The gradual shift of star positions over thousands of years is subtle. It reveals itself only to those who pay attention not just once, but continuously. Knowledge like that cannot be centralized easily. It grows quietly, distributed across communities that share stories and return to the same observations year after year. This makes the later religious framing of the sky feel less like invention and more like formalization. Gods were assigned names and roles, but the behavior of the heavens had already been learned. Myth followed measurement, not the other way around. When the builders of Giza oriented their structures with such confidence, they were not guessing. They were continuing a dialogue with the sky that had already lasted millennia. The stones did not need to teach them where north was. The sky had done that long before. Seen in this light, Egyptian astronomy does not stand alone. It stands at the end of a long inheritance. A tradition shaped under open skies, carried across green plains that no longer exist, refined through observation before it was ever written down. The sky before the pharaohs was not empty. It was watched carefully, patiently, and when stone finally rose to meet it, the alignment felt inevitable because it had already been practiced countless times in quiet. Before walls were raised and fields were claimed, water was already being understood, not as something to dominate, but as something to anticipate. Long before canals were drawn across floodplains and reservoirs carved into limestone, people had learned that survival depended on reading water's behavior with care and restraint. Across regions now defined by dryness, the ground still bears subtle signs of this early attention. Shallow channels trace gentle paths across ancient basins. Stone-lined depressions sit near what were once lakes, positioned just high enough to collect runoff without being washed away. These are not accidents of erosion. They are choices, small, deliberate adjustments made to extend the presence of water a little longer into the dry season. Such work does not announce itself. It is easy to overlook. There are no monumental embankments or inscriptions praising those who shaped it. Yet its logic is precise. These early water systems do not attempt to redirect entire rivers. They respond to the land as it is, working with slope, soil, and seasonal flow rather than against them. What is striking is how widespread these practices appear to have been. From the margins of the Sahara to the edges of the Nile Delta, similar solutions emerge again and again. Narrow channels cut straight across uneven ground, pits reinforced with stone to prevent collapse. Basins positioned where rainwater naturally gathered, then subtly improved to make collection more reliable. This suggests something important. Knowledge of water was not isolated. It moved with people. It adapted to new environments, but it retained its underlying principles. Where rain was brief, it was caught. Where floods came predictably, they were guided. Where water lingered, it was preserved. In a world without permanent rivers in many regions, this skill would have been essential. Communities could not afford to guess. They had to learn where water would appear, how long it would stay, and how to make the most of it without exhausting the land. This required observation across generations, not experimentation driven by urgency. As the climate shifted and rainfall retreated, these skills became even more valuable. Groups that understood water could linger longer in marginal areas. They could plan movement rather than flee. And when they finally migrated toward more stable sources, they arrived with a deep familiarity that would shape everything that followed. The Nile, with its annual flood, did not introduce the idea of water management. It amplified it. Those who settled along its banks already knew how to read seasonal flow. They recognized subtle changes in level, color, and timing. The river became a teacher they already understood how to listen to. This is why early Nile settlements show such confidence in their placement. Villages rise just above floodlines. Storage areas appear where water could be accessed without danger. Channels begin small, following natural contours rather than cutting aggressively through them. These are not the actions of beginners. Later, as populations grew and authority centralized, water management became more visible. Canals expanded. Control systems grew more complex. But complexity does not imply origin. It implies refinement. The foundations of these systems were already in place, carried into the valley by people who had learned their lessons elsewhere. In this light, water engineering appears not as a sudden achievement of Egyptian civilization, but as an inheritance shaped by necessity long before the Nile became a center of power. The river offered consistency. The people offered experience. The first masters of water did not leave monuments. They left habits, ways of thinking that valued patience over force, timing over speed. These habits allowed later societies to flourish where others might have failed. When monumental construction finally rose along the Nile, it did so in a landscape already understood. Water was no longer an unpredictable threat. It was a rhythm, and that rhythm had been learned far earlier, under open skies and across lands that no longer exist in the form they once did. The river did not teach civilization how to manage water. Civilization arrived already knowing how quietly, confidently, and movement rarely leaves clear traces. Unlike walls or monuments, migration dissolves as it happens, remembered only in fragment stalls dropped. Paths worn smooth, habits carried forward into new places. Yet the story of early human movement across North Africa can still be followed, not as a straight line, but as a slow drift guided by water, climate, and memory. As rainfall declined and lakes retreated, communities did not abandon their worlds all at once. They adjusted. Camps shifted closer to shrinking shorelines. Routes between basins became longer. Familiar places were revisited year after year until they no longer answered. Only then did people move on, carrying with them knowledge shaped by the land they were leaving behind. This migration was not chaotic. It unfolded over centuries, even millennia. People followed corridors that nature itself had drawn in ancient riverbeds, seasonal valleys, and chains of water sources that once stitched the Sahara together. These routes were not invented. They were discovered through repetition, remembered through use. Along these paths, certain skills proved essential. Knowing how to read terrain, recognizing stone suitable for tools or construction, understanding how far water could be trusted to last. These were not abstract lessons. They were lived experience, reinforced by survival. And as groups moved, they carried these lessons into every new environment they entered. When the flow turned decisively eastward, it did so gradually. The Nile Valley did not suddenly appear as a destination. It became one through accumulation. Each dry season made the river more attractive. Each failed return to an old lake strengthened the pull. By the time movement concentrated toward the Nile, the choice felt inevitable. What arrived at the river was not a single people, but many. Groups from different regions converged, bringing overlapping but distinct traditions. Some had lived closer to the desert interior. Others traveled along fading waterways. Still others approached from uplands or coastal routes. Their tools differed slightly. Their rituals carried regional flavor. But beneath these differences lay shared understanding. They recognized stable ground instinctively. They knew how to orient shelters. They understood how to manage water without exhausting it. They had already learned how to observe the sky for timing and direction. These shared practices allowed diverse groups to coexist, blend and adapt rather than compete immediately for dominance. As settlements formed, ideas began to converge. Techniques refined under open plains were tested along riverbanks. Temporary solutions became permanent structures. Knowledge once scattered across vast landscapes condensed into a narrow corridor. The Nile did not erase what came before it. It concentrated it. This convergence explains an otherwise puzzling feature of early Egyptian culture. Its rapid confidence. Architecture, surveying, and planning appear early, not as hesitant experiments, but as assured expressions. Such confidence rarely emerges spontaneously. It is inherited. The long migration east did more than move people. It moved perspective. Life in a fluctuating environment had taught adaptability. Life along a reliable river rewarded foresight. Together, these lessons formed the foundation of a civilization capable of thinking beyond immediate survival. As memory of the Sahara's greener past faded, the origin of these skills grew obscure. The river became the center of identity. The desert beyond was reimagined as emptiness rather than homeland. The migration itself slipped out of cultural memory, replaced by stories that began at the river's edge. Yet the evidence remains, scattered across stone and soil, in techniques that feel older than their context, in choices that suggest long familiarity rather than sudden inspiration, in the sense that when Egypt emerged, it did so already prepared. The long migration east was not an escape from failure. It was the final chapter of adaptation, a quiet transfer of knowledge from a world that was disappearing to one that could sustain it. And in that transfer, the seeds of later greatness were carried unseen into the valley where history would finally learn how to write itself. When the pyramids finally rise into view, they do so with a confidence that feels almost unsettling. Their angles are precise. Their orientation is exact. Their placement suggests forethought rather than improvisation. Nothing about Giza looks experimental. Nothing appears hesitant. It does not read like the first attempt of a civilization discovering its own abilities. It reads like the continuation of something already understood. This is the detail that quietly reframes everything. Civilizations rarely begin at their most refined. Early phases tend to leave behind awkward form structures that test ideas, correct mistakes, and reveal learning in progress. Giza shows none of this. It presents itself as a culmination, a moment when multiple lines of knowledge converge cleanly, without visible strain. Such convergence implies inheritance. The plateau itself feels prepared rather than conquered. Its surface is leveled where precision matters. Its axes align with cardinal directions, as if those directions were already familiar. The choice of location does not feel symbolic alone. It feels practical. Stable ground, clear horizons, predictable sightlines, to sky and land alike. These are not discoveries made overnight. When later builders planned Giza, they were not simply imposing geometry on an empty landscape. They were responding to cues already present, subtle adjustments in terrain, existing alignments, foundations that suggested where balance could be found. In this sense, Giza behaves less like a starting point and more like a reply. Even the scale of the project reflects this continuity. Monumental construction requires more than ambition. It requires trust in measurement, in material, in coordination. That trust does not arise from theory. It arises from experience. Experience gained through smaller, quieter projects repeated over long spans of time. The tools used at Giza, the logistics of moving stone, the organization of labor, all of these rests on assumptions about what is possible. Those assumptions were not invented on the plateau. They were brought there, carried forward from practices refined elsewhere, then focused and amplified. This is why attempts to isolate Giza from its broader context feel incomplete. When examined alone, the site appears miraculous. When viewed as part of a continuum, it becomes intelligible. Extraordinary, yes, but not inexplicable. The miracle lies not in sudden brilliance, but in long preparation finally finding its stage. In this light, the pyramids do not negate earlier traditions. They validate them. They take ideas once expressed through stones placed quietly in open ground and render them permanent. They transform temporary alignments into eternal ones. What had once been marked lightly on the land is now fixed in stone. The transition from scattered practice to centralized expression did not erase the past. It absorbed it. Knowledge that once moved through small groups, now moved through institutions. Skills once shared informally were standardized. What had been learned under open skies was sealed within architecture. This reframing also explains why so much of earlier history feels missing. When inheritance is seamless, origins fade quickly. Later generations remember results, not processes. They record what they build, not the countless small steps that made building possible. Giza stands, then, not as the birth of Egyptian genius, but as its crystallization, a place where ancient habits, observing, measuring, aligning, preparing, were finally given monumental form. The pyramids are not isolated achievements. They are the visible surface of a much deeper current. Seen this way, the question is no longer who built Giza, but what knowledge arrived there. The answer does not require a lost empire or a forgotten name. It requires only time, movement, and continuity. Giza was not invented in a moment of inspiration. It was inherited quietly, patiently, from a world that had already learned how to shape land, read sky, and wait for the right place to bring everything together. As the story begins to slow, the landscape itself seems to exhale. The desert grows still again, and the long movement of ideas that once crossed it fades into the background. What remains is not an answer, but a feeling one that settles gently rather than demanding resolution. The civilization that prepared the world for Giza left no cities for us to walk through, no texts to translate, no kings to place on timelines. Its presence survives in a different way, in habits embedded in stone, in alignments that feel confident rather than accidental, in techniques that appear fully formed when history first notices them. This kind of civilization is difficult to recognize because it does not behave like the ones we are taught to look for. It does not announce itself through conquest or spectacle. It does not demand remembrance. Instead, it moves quietly, shaping how people think before shaping what they build. It prepares ground rather than claiming it. When Egypt finally emerges into written history, it does so with remarkable clarity. Names, dates, rituals, and symbols appear almost fully formed. To later observers, this can feel like a sudden awakening. But awakenings rarely happen without preparation. More often, they mark the moment when long, silent work becomes visible. The desert keeps that silence well. Beneath its sand lie traces of choices made slowly, places where people returned again and again until the land itself remembered them. Stones placed not to impress, but to orient. Ground leveled not to display power, but to make future action possible. None of this needed permanence to be effective. It needed only consistency. Over time, as climates shifted and memory narrowed, the origins of these practices blurred. What remained were result structures, alignments, systems that seemed to appear without precedent. But precedent was there, woven into the land rather than recorded on it. Understanding this changes how the past feels. It becomes less about sudden brilliance and more about patience. Less about isolated genius and more about continuity. Civilization, in this view, is not a leap forward. It is a layering each generation, building on ground shaped by those who came before, often without knowing their names. The quiet civilization beneath the sand does not ask to be rediscovered in full. It cannot be reconstructed completely. Too much time has passed. Too many materials have returned to the earth. What it offers instead is perspective. A reminder that history is deeper than memory, and knowledge often travels farther than stories. When we look at Giza now, the pyramids remain unchanged. They still command the horizon. But behind their certainty lies something softer. A sense that they are not alone. That they stand as the visible crest of a wave whose origins stretch far beyond the limits of recorded time. And in that realization, there is a kind of calm. The past does not collapse into mystery. It opens into patience. It suggests that humanity has been learning, adjusting, and preparing for far longer than our written histories admit. That even in silence, civilizations can exist not to rule, but to ready the world for what comes next. As the desert settles into night once more, the stones remain. They do not speak. They do not need to. Their work was done long before anyone thought to ask who they belonged to. And perhaps that is the final lesson they leave behind.